All right. So today I'm going to be talking about developing virtual communities by creating a disability justice podcast. So, for some background on me, I grew up in rural Oregon, in Silverton specifically, before I went to study film and television production at USC School of Cinematic Arts in Los Angeles. I graduated in 2020. So I came back during COVID and ended up getting into political organizing and political education during quarantine. Currently, I am residing in Brooklyn. I just moved. While I continue to produce and host the podcast Voices in Action for EOSIL, which is the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living. And that's the podcast that I'll be talking about today. Moving to slide 3. So why podcasts? So podcasts are a great tool of organizing and educating people. Specifically, a lot of podcasts focus on kind of national organizations or take a very wide lens look at things and can be very intimidating to a lot of people, or somebody can think, why would I focus on a podcast on my state, right? Like, is that too specific? And the answer is absolutely not. So the benefit of doing a state-specific podcast for something like disability justice is that it gives you the chance to network locally with individuals and grassroots organizations. It forces you to look really deeply at people near you, in community with you, around you, friends, family, acquaintances that are doing really cool work. Because that's often overlooked. If it's not on a national scale, it often doesn't get a lot of press, a lot of attention. But the best form of political action is direct action. So the kind of mutual aid that we give with others in our community. So, by focusing on that, we're able to contribute to mutual aid and community aid rather than a kind of bureaucratic, vague, large nonprofit look at things. So, bringing in community members to participate in and listen to important discussions is also really important. And it's a great way to contextualize local issues into larger systemic problems. So something that was the goal for me in doing this podcast was expanding how we think of disability justice and how we think of accessibility. A lot of people view disability as a monolith, which it is definitely not. No marginalized identity, no community is a monolith. But this really gives a chance to expand how we think of disability issues and how we can tie in other advocacy issues into disability advocacy work. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit more moving forward when I give examples of when I talk about the episodes that I've done for the podcast so far. The other thing is that it is a great way to provide resources and volunteer opportunities for listeners. So by focusing again on state or county specific organizations and individuals, it is a chance to give listeners the opportunity to learn about people who may be in need of assistance, who may be in need of volunteers that are just, a half-hour drive away. And the other great thing about this too is that because of the way that I personally structure my podcast episodes, I make sure to include further resources for further education about the given topic of a podcast. So it's a great way to introduce people to a topic, and then also give them the chance to dive further into it at the end if they would like. And that's not to say that you can't come back and do another in-depth look at the issue or look at it from a different angle. But I know that people learn in different ways. So something that I've tried to push for accessibility purposes too is saying, okay, you've listened to the podcast, but maybe you're not so much of an auditory learner and you would prefer to read a book about this topic. Here's a list of books. I only do one book an episode, so it's not overwhelming, but again, that's fully dependent on what you would like to do. And maybe I recommend a different podcast that delves more into this specific topic. And again, I'm also going to talk about specific resources further into this presentation. And the great thing about podcasts, especially during COVID, is that they are accessible. So I include transcripts for the podcasts, and they are also accessible in terms of creating them, particularly for remote recording. You do not need a fancy setup. You do not need to be in the same room as the people you're interviewing, as the people you're talking with. You do not need to be in the same country. While I grew up in Oregon, and obviously this podcast is focused, Voices in Action is focused on Oregon, and I have connections there. Like I said, I recently moved across the country and am living in New York, and I'm still able to do the podcast. So that's a great thing to be aware of as well. So moving on to slide 4. All right. So from a technical perspective, the thing that can sometimes be very intimidating, which I get, you need a skilled editor. You definitely need a researcher. You need a producer. You need an interviewer, and you need a recording setup. Right now, I am doing all of these things for Voices in Action, and it is a lot of work. I also, because of my background and because of my passion for, growing my own political education and the time that I have to do my own research, am able to do and take on all of these different roles, but that is not the case for everyone. And so something that's really important too is to really make sure that everybody is, able to focus on what they are best at and not to sacrifice any element of the podcast for the sake of efficiency or anything like that. So I will talk about specific tools in a bit in terms of, specific recording setups and things like that. But to talk quickly about specific things like research, I do a lot of reading. I am on social media quite a bit, and constantly reaching out and learning from grassroots organizations and constantly trying to connect with people. And it is very time consuming, but it is really important, especially in terms of digging in deeper and contextualizing an interview after it's been recorded. I often dive into a book or two that helps me add depth to the interview and the editing process. I will read a passage from the book and add that in if a guest speaker is talking about something adjacent to that, and I can add some more historical background to it or tie it in kind of to disability again. But again, that's very time consuming and definitely something to be aware of and kind of planning on building this out. The other thing is you need a producer. So the tricky thing that I have found is getting guest speakers. And it is one of those things where you will reach out to 20 people and maybe one person will respond saying, yes, I'm interested. I would love to talk with you. So finding those 20 people to reach out to, taking the time to craft those messages, those emails of reaching out to them is very time consuming, especially because they, only one person will get back to you. And then it's also a matter of making sure you're on the same page. Understandably, some people that I've interviewed have been very hesitant about speaking publicly, about sharing their story, sharing their name, and want to make sure that we are coming at it from, relatively speaking, the same viewpoint with the same goals in mind. And so sometimes I will have preliminary meetings with guest speakers to answer any questions or concerns they might have, to be very upfront with them about how I'm approaching the topic, so that, they feel comfortable and that, we are avoiding miscommunication. And the way that I have found a lot of my guest speakers is a variety of things. Reaching out to people in my community, friends, family members, and even reaching out to organizations on Instagram. Sometimes a friend of a friend will hear about it and reach out to me. I've also had some luck just doing research. If I know I want to cover an episode on a specific topic, I will just spend a lot of time Googling, looking for organizations I feel would be a great match, and emailing them, and have had some luck there as well. So there's no guarantee. It definitely takes a lot of different ways to try to connect with people. But I've had great success in all of these different tactics. So the other thing too is that, I said that when I know that I want to focus on a specific topic, I'll do research to find organizations that fit that topic. But what I have also found is that sometimes I will hear about somebody who I feel would be interesting to interview, and the topic of the podcast will come later. So sometimes I will interview someone thinking they have a story or something specific to share. I don't know how I would turn it into a full episode yet, what angle I want to take, but making a podcast like this is kind of similar to making a documentary film, where you can have a general idea in mind. You can have a location you want to explore, a person you want to learn about, but you don't really know the story until you're done filming and you're in the editing room and have all the materials there. And then you can kind of craft the narrative. So don't be afraid to also just jump in and say, I have a chance to interview this interesting person. The way that I'll tie it in, that will come later. So you also need an interviewer. This can absolutely be any of the other people. It's just a matter of who's comfortable talking with people, sometimes about very difficult topics. This could, the producer can also be the interviewer. Again, this isn't necessarily something that it needs to be a separate role. I just put it in a separate role because I know not everyone is comfortable speaking with people, and again, talking about sometimes very difficult and complicated subjects. And ironically, interviewing is actually the piece of it all that takes the least amount of time. So everything else takes quite a bit of time, and an interview will generally be 45 minutes to an hour. And I really enjoy it. I love having these conversations with people, but it is definitely the shortest part of this whole podcast process. So the final thing is that you need a recording setup, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Again, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, just, a basic knowledge of sound quality, and especially how Zoom works, and how you may use Zoom to interview people remotely, but you might want to have a separate microphone for your end if you have the finances for it. So, but again, I mean, it's perfectly possible to do a podcast just with the audio you get from Zoom. So it's dependent on what financially you're able to afford, what your budget looks like, and that kind of thing. But we'll talk about that more a little bit later. So let me make sure, please. Moving on to slide 5. Yes, so Other elements, you absolutely should pay guests for their time. Again, because Voices in Action is through EOSIL, I am able to pay guests we are able to pay guests a $50 stipend for their time. Obviously, if a guest is, we had some conversations, to be very honest, we had some conversations trying to navigate how we wanted to pay people, how much we wanted to pay people, because some high profile guests, which I think everybody that we've had would be considered on equal footing, which is already kind of a strange thing to say about people who are all doing great work. But if you are bringing on a high profile speaker, they may ask for more money. And so that's something to consider. But what I really wanted to do was I wanted to be able to pay people for their time, because everybody should be. And I also was of the mindset that everybody should be paid equally. Just because somebody has been organizing for 10 years and may have more followers on Instagram doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, mean that they are worth more than somebody else who's taking the same amount of time to share their story. But that's a more complicated subject. And again, it depends on, if you're doing this through an organization, it can also be dependent on what finances are allocated for the podcast. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's a wrong way to do it. And you don't, again, because I know that finances can be tricky, if you are not able to pay your guests, I wouldn't say don't do a podcast until you can. But you also really just want to be respectful of people's time and energy that they're putting into it. And the other thing is, be open to topics. So I kind of mentioned this already, but be open to topics that you may not immediately connect to disability. Taking this kind of route has been where I have found some of the best conversations happen, because ultimately everything is tied to disability. Everything is interconnected to accessibility, to disability justice, to many other marginalized identities. You can't address disability without addressing if someone is a person of color or if someone is white, right? That definitely ties into it. If you are trans and disabled, that is also a very unique intersection. You can't really separate the two in those discussions. So taking this approach of saying, okay, even if this topic may not immediately say, this is absolutely about disability, take a second and see, because it often is interconnected. We've talked about environmental justice. We've talked about being disabled and Indigenous on the podcast. We've talked about being trans and disabled. We've talked about the prison industrial complex and how that relates to disability. And so taking this larger lens and saying, what are other issues in our community that need a platform to be elevated, that people are looking to hear more about, that we can relate back to disability and give people a new perspective on. And the other thing is staying organized. There are so many moving pieces all of the time with this podcast, with any podcast, really. Because of the nature of how it's done, it is a bit chaotic. Sometimes you will have an interview that won't go on the air for a few months. Sometimes you will be interviewing someone and immediately know that we have to get this up. This has to be our next episode, because we don't have any other interviews on the back burner. Again, this is very dependent on your setup. If you have a podcast team, hopefully that will lead it to be a little bit of a smoother process with a little bit more buffer. But right now, based off of my experience being the only one working on this podcast, it is very important for me to stay organized, because I want to make sure that even as I am trying to reach out to people for new interviews. I'm scheduling interviews with people I'd previously reached out to, while also editing episodes that need to go out soon, and also polishing those final episodes that need to be airing right now. And then finally getting the transcripts out for those episodes that were recently published. So everything kind of happens all at once. So it's very important that everybody's staying on top of things, and that, communication is key. And also just being accessible and not accessible, sorry, patient and understanding. Sometimes guests will cancel on you last minute. Things will get switched around. Sometimes an episode won't come together in time. So it's just a matter of being understanding as well, because everybody is trying their best. And finally, it is really important to communicate with guests during, before, and after. So I like to give guests the option to listen to episodes before they air. At best, they won't have any issues, but sometimes they will want to correct or add to something that they said, or, just correct something. And sometimes if you have time, you can bring them on for another 5-minute interview thing to correct it. But if you're low on time, it's not the smoothest option technically because of the sound being different. But you can always request that they record their new answers on their iPhones or on their computer and then send it to you. I've absolutely done that before. It's, not the end of the world. And it's most important to make sure that the guests feel like they are being accurately and fairly represented and heard. And I have only had one issue with a guest being concerned about how the episode was framed. And so that's something I'll talk about in a little bit, but that can happen if, in the editing process, looking back, contextualizing what they say, you may run into a bit of an issue where you disagree with the way that they addressed something, and you want to talk about that on the podcast. So that is an issue that can happen. And I will talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to hold for a second and give people the chance to ask questions so far before moving forward.
And just remember, you can press *9 to raise your hand, or select the hand raise option, or drop your question in the Q&A box.
Leo, it doesn't look like we have any right now. So maybe if you want to go ahead, and if anybody wants to add them in, I'll interrupt you.
For sure. Sounds good. Oh, there we go.
One did just come in.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
And so it is, do you have an outline that you use for an interview?
Yes. So the first time that I did an interview with someone, I had a list of questions that I created, and it did not occur to me to send it to the person I was interviewing, which didn't turn out to be an issue. It wasn't, it wasn't a very personal interview. It was, talking about their opinions as medical professionals regarding the COVID vaccine. But then I did have one, I think right after that, I had a guest who asked to see the questions beforehand. And I immediately was like, oh, yes, I absolutely should do that. So I do some research, and then I create a list of questions, and that list of questions is my outline for the interview. But I tell people up front when I'm interviewing them that first I give them the questions in advance. And if they have issues with any of the questions, or want to add a question or take away a question or change the way it's worded, we have that conversation. And then day of, during the interview, I make sure to tell people that this is not a hard and fast outline of we have to get to every question. It is very much following the flow of a conversation. So during that conversation, sometimes we will go completely a different direction, and that's totally fine. If needed, I might sometimes circle back, which can be a little bit awkward just in terms of the thought process. It might be a little jolted. Sometimes in the editing room, I will move a later portion of the interview to a better spot where it makes more sense. But generally speaking, my outline is just the list of questions. And because I'm constantly reading all of these books, generally about the topics that I'm focused on for the podcast, I will have kind of in the back of my head as I'm reading these books, potential ways that I might want to incorporate some of what I'm reading in either the questions or the editing room later on. So there's no hard and fast kind of rule to it. It's very much a topic dependent thing. If I know a lot about a given topic, I'm much more comfortable coming up with the questions off the top of my head. If I have no idea what the topic is and I'm really coming in without any prior knowledge, then I base a lot of my research afterwards on what I learned during the interview. So yeah.
So we have a couple more that came in. First off, a comment that says, I'm really pleased to hear you say that guests are paid. So many times consumers presenting are not valued with a stipend or any other pay. So that was just a comment. Next, we have somebody who asks, when speaking on topics of disability, how would you go about interviewing someone who may have tics, unpredictable speech patterns, or difficulty communicating in a traditional sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually just had a great interview with a filmmaker who stutters and made a documentary about stuttering and exploring his family's history of stuttering and things like that. And we had a really cool conversation about it. And I was asking him about how the best way for me to consider changing the way I edit podcasts moving forward and the way he would like the specific podcast edited. So in this case, I brought up the fact that I spend a lot of hours meticulously editing out pauses or repetitions, which just naturally come with speech, or saying, which I mean, I've been doing now. So it's for myself and for the other person, and to make an efficient use of that space. But that said, I even mentioned that, you know, in the audio editing world, there is this thing called clean sound, which implies the existence of dirty sound, which feels a little ableist in some ways, because what exactly is clean sound and what is dirty sound, and how do we edit out or keep in people's different speech patterns? And so he was basically saying that he loves hearing other people stuttering on interviews or in movies, and he absolutely wanted to keep his stutter in, which going in, I absolutely assumed and wasn't planning on editing it out, but it was something that I thought would be great to have a conversation on. So I also have, and this was due to time constraints more than anything, to be honest, but I did have one time where I needed some consumers, short testimony about utilizing an HIV service program, and I was running out of time. So I asked them to submit just short written testimonies that I could read and then record and share on the podcast. So I think having conversations and being upfront about what they would feel most comfortable with is the most important thing. And being aware of different modes, you know, if somebody is uncomfortable being interviewed, being recorded, you can always have them submit a written, their written answers to questions that you ask them that you could read yourself or you have somebody else read. You can also ask them, okay, if they, if you have tics, like what's the best way to proceed? Do you want these, included? What is the best way to set up these interviews? Sometimes people will not want to be on camera at all during interviews, which is totally fine. That's not a prerequisite, obviously. It's an auditory medium. I generally do, just because I like to be able to read people's body language. But I mean, if a person requests, because I've been doing basically all of my interviews via Zoom or through the phone. If somebody requests to have their camera off, then that's also totally an option. So I think just having those upfront conversations is the most important thing, and making sure not to edit out pieces of a person. Yeah, I think that's the end of that sentence too. And ask them what they're most comfortable with, how they're most comfortable sharing their stories or speaking with you. So, yeah.
Okay, so we have two more questions.
Okay.
And then, so the first one is, do you have any tips for delicately handling such sensitive topics?
It really depends on the topic, and it also, so it's interesting. So sensitive topics can also mean different things in different contexts. So on the screen right now is my next slide, where I break down the episodes that we've done so far of the podcast. And one of the episodes was talking about sex work and how we need to decriminalize sex work. And this would definitely be considered a sensitive topic for a lot of reasons. But I found it was much easier to have that conversation than it was to have a conversation about prison abolition with a different guest, who was not necessarily on the same page as me about some things. And so it's really interesting because, it's also different if we might be going a different way in an interview that I wasn't expecting. I might be honest and give people the chance to say, I don't want to talk about that. So in one of our most recent episodes, Disability from an Indigenous Perspective, the conversation kind of led to a chance for me to bring up talking about residential schools, which wasn't something we had previously agreed on, or something that I didn't even think it was going to come up in the conversation, but I felt it would be possibly a good chance to bring that up. And so I asked my guest speaker point blank, I said, you absolutely don't have to talk about this if you're not comfortable. We can move on, but I just wanted to bring this up because I feel like it's relevant and could be a good conversation to have, but only if you're comfortable. And she said she was totally fine. And so we continued on with the conversation. So it's really dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on, with the sex work episode, for instance, I interviewed two sex workers who obviously this was their work and their backgrounds. And so they were used to having these conversations. They were very comfortable talking about them. And so while audiences may view it, or people who aren't familiar with sex work may be more viewing it of it as a uncomfortable or sensitive topic, it wasn't an awkward conversation to have because they were very comfortable talking about it. And so I think it's just kind of, again, that open communication of also trying to figure out what exactly is the point of your question too, because I have a lot of interviews with people who have very different lived experiences than me. Especially, if I'm interviewing, I've interviewed plenty of guests who are people of color, and being white, I want to be very aware of that dynamic and trying not to come across as kind of, what's the term I'm looking for? I'm completely blanking on the term, but I don't want to put them in a position where they feel like they need to they're obligated to kind of share their trauma for my sake or anything like that. And so again, trying to figure out what are the point of these questions. Am I trying to get them to share their trauma just for the sake of sharing their trauma, or is there a specific element to their story that would be really helpful to add to this conversation? And again, I've just honestly found the best luck just being honest and saying, hey, if you're not comfortable with this, we don't have to talk about it, but this is something that was interesting to me about what you said. And so it's very situational, but yeah, I hope that was helpful. It was a good
Okay,
question.
so we have one more question right now, and then we have the next one ready for the next question break. But do you have any sponsors for the podcast? And could sponsors possibly help compensate the guests for their time?
We do not have sponsors right now. We're funded purely through the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living, which I think is probably just possible because right now it's not a team, it's just me. So costs, I would say, and also I have a very minimal tech setup. So I would say in comparison to some larger budget podcasts, expenses are relatively low, but sponsors are definitely possible for podcasts. Lots of others do it. I personally don't have experience navigating that. And I would also caution in terms of just being awareness of what the sponsors would, I guess, what you would be bringing to the table, what you would be promoting or talking about, and making sure that the sponsorships align with the values of the podcast. Because something that can get tricky, and this is true even of things just with any organization, is, falling in line with what the organization wants you to say rather than what is necessary, like what necessary conversations are to have. And so if you have sponsors, they may be uncomfortable being associated with certain conversations that may happen later on. Again, this is not coming from personal experience. This is just me kind of thinking about it as I'm talking through it. But in terms of costs from just a purely financial standpoint, it absolutely is possible, and would definitely, that's how a lot of podcasts keep going, is through sponsors. So I know one podcast actually is supported through Patreon. So they will have people who pay like $1 a month, and the podcast is free, but if you support them, you get all of these extra things like early access to episodes or extra interviews and things like that for like $1 a month or $5 a month. And so that's how they're able to keep going. So that's also a potential way, if you have a decent listener base who could financially chip in, that's a way to get around that too.
Okay, why don't you go back to your slides and then we'll swing around to questions again in a little bit, okay?
Okay, sounds good. So now I am going to talk about the episodes of the podcast of Voices in Action that we've had so far, and kind of talk a little bit about some things that I learned. Episode 1 was exploring the COVID-19 vaccine. This was the first episode, very much a learning curve of trying to figure out how I wanted to structure episodes, still getting comfortable with interviewing people and trying to figure out how many interviews I want per episode. So it does have a different setup or a different style than the rest of the podcast. It's not drastic, but I know I also talk very quickly in it. So it was a learning curve. Part 1 and part 2 was about housing as a human right. Ultimately, because of the length of these interviews, I decided on splitting them into 2 episodes, but moving forward, in a lot of cases, if interviews are about the same topic, I will try, and they're relatively short, I will try to put 2 interviews in the same episode. And part of that has to do with the numbers. Honestly, I was looking at how housing as a human right part 1 did in terms of statistics versus part 2. The listener drop off was pretty high. So that's something to possibly consider. disability and abolition was fantastic and one of my favorite episodes. I got to speak with two organizers from an amazing organization called Critical Resistance. They're a national organization, but they have a chapter in Portland. And I really wanted to talk about how disability is related to the prison industrial complex and the high rates of incarcerated people with disabilities and how disability ties into the prison system itself. And that was a great conversation to have. And that was interesting too, because I had two different speakers from the same organization talking with me. And that was a little tricky over Zoom, only because sometimes we would talk over each other and then like have to stop, or there would be long, slightly awkward pauses while we waited on who to talk with. But that from a technical element too, it was a little bit tricky editing because I didn't have things split into multiple channels. But those are conversations where if you know that you're going to interview somebody or multiple people at the same time, from a technical perspective, that's definitely a longer conversation that I'd be happy to have with people. Navigating the healthcare system as a trans person was really great. This one was slightly different. I interviewed two people, one of whom is trans and disabled, and the other person who is trans and working for So Healthy, which is the Southern Oregon health education network, I want to say. Oh, I feel so bad. I'm completely blanking on it. But basically they're doing great work. And she had done a presentation with them and I'd sat in on one meeting and thought she would be a great person to talk with. And while she isn't disabled, we had a great conversation talking about how she uses accessibility plans on college campuses to provide accommodations for students who are trans and need accommodations in a way that applies to disability in a sense. We were talking about how both transness and disability are pathologized and how that's kind of a double-edged sword of diagnosing can be a helpful tool in terms of getting access to resources, but it can also be negative because then it's seen as a medical issue rather than a person being a person. So that was a really interesting conversation that I enjoyed. Episode 6 was about grassroots organizations in Corvallis and the coast. This one was a little bit disconnected, I will say, to be fair. I was trying to figure out the best way to have these two interviews. And they were both talking about creating communities and resources and kind of on the coast, especially in a space where there's not a whole lot of resources out there. And Corvallis has some great stuff happening with the Disability Equity Center that's growing, and that's super cool. After incarceration, reentry resources was the slightly tricky one, where one of my guests was a bit concerned with how I'd framed some of her words. What she was saying concerned me a bit, and I didn't really process it until I was editing, and I was a bit concerned by her take on certain things that I felt wasn't very productive. And so I was a bit critical of that. And when she listened to the podcast before it aired, she was pretty upset. And so that was a process of having that conversation, that hard conversation of her clarifying and me trying to meet her in the middle, but also standing my ground and saying, you know, I'm kind of uncomfortable with the criticism that you've got here. And so that was tricky, but eventually she was happy with how it turned out. And I felt like it was I felt like overall we reached a good common ground. Episode 8 was Sex Work is Real Work. That was a great one. I had conversations with 2 sex workers, one of whom is working on decriminalizing sex work in Oregon. And we had a great conversation because a lot of people in sex work have disabilities for a variety of reasons. Because a lot of other job options aren't open to people with disabilities, and there's a lot of freedom and autonomy to be found in sex work. And so, the policing of people's bodies, disabled or otherwise, really plays into the criminalization of sex work. And so that was a really cool conversation we got to have. HIV services in rural Oregon was our 9th episode. So that was about the HIV services program that EOSIL actually provides out in Eastern Oregon. And so that was a great conversation, tying back to the main organization that is the whole reason for the podcast existing, and had some great speakers there. And then episode 10 was about disability from an Indigenous perspective. And so that was talking about this one professor, Dr. White Bear, who works at OSU, and her experience as a disabled and Indigenous person, and how all of these movements that she works with, the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, the general environmental justice movement, all ties into disability justice and her own personal experience. And then the episode, most recent episode that is about to go up, is the art as advocacy, which is really cool. And so I won't give away too much about that yet, but that was talking about art as a resource for disabled people and a form of healing, and 2 specific organizations, art organizations that work to be inclusive and encourage artists. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about tech resources. This is totally up to like individuals. This is not a hardcore, rule. The hosting platform that we use is Buzzsprout. So you have to have a hosting platform. You can't just upload your podcast to Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You need a third-party hosting platform, and then you add it through there to the various podcast site. Buzzsprout has been really easy to use. I think we pay, it's like $13 a month. And very easy to use. They give you lots of helpful statistics. So that's the one that I found helpful. The editing system I use is Adobe Premiere Pro, which is actually the video editing system. It's not the audio editing system, but because of my background, it's what I'm most familiar with, and it's what I have. So that's what I've been using to, again, cut down costs. But there's Audition, which is through Adobe, and Pro Tools is actually, in my opinion, superior to Adobe. Pro Tools audio is it's very intuitive. And I would be happy to talk with anyone about any of these technical aspects. But if you're interested in diving into editing and want to start somewhere, I would honestly suggest Pro Tools. It is more expensive, but the level of audio editing and the way that it's built just makes a lot of sense to me. So that might be something where down the line, Voices in Action switches over to that. And the transcription site I use is otter.ai. I've had this is the one that Buzzsprout recommended I use, and so I tried it. I've had a few problems with it. Uploading, you're supposed to export it as a specific file and then upload it to Buzzsprout, and it's supposed to be easy. I haven't had that experience. Otter AI has been easy to use, but I've had to come up with some workarounds to get it on Buzzsprout. So I haven't tried anything else yet, but it's solid to use. It's just, if you are using both Otter and Buzzsprout and need some help figuring that out, please feel free to reach out to me. And equipment is very much a case-by-case basis and dependent on budget. So I use my laptop for the Zoom interviews, and then I have the brand Zoom, not the Zoom platform, microphone that I've had because I bought forever ago for my filming projects, and that's worked great. Moving forward, will probably invest in some kind of microphone specifically for podcasting. but I haven't had any issues just using what I have so far. People can also use their iPhones to record sound. Again, if you want to come reach out to me and say like, this is what I have, how can I use this? I'd be more than happy to have those conversations. And here on slide 8, I have a list of political education resources that I love and highly, highly, highly recommend people check out. The 3 podcasts listed are Disability Visibility with Alice Wong, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, and the Red Nation podcast. And I have learned so much and love everything that they do. So highly recommend those. And books, I read so many books. I love AK Press and Verso Books. Those are 2 publishers. I have a long list of books of a variety of topics. If you ever want to reach out and need help finding resources for a very specific topic, please do. I keep so many resources just in my collection. But specifically, the ones that I recommended here are Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex by Insight, Disability and Capitalism by Marta Russell, Decarcerating Disability by Liat Ben Moshe, and Beyond Survival by Ajaris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina, and Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. And a good chunk of these I've recommended on the podcast too. You can also check out there. I include links to most of these at some point on any given episode. But highly recommend checking out some of these. I mean, even just the publishers, AK Press as an independent publisher just does amazing work. And so you can't go wrong by going to their website and typing in a topic and looking on what you find. And some social media resources on people to follow or movements to follow. I think all of these are just on Instagram, to be honest. Some of them may be on Facebook, but most of this organizing happens on Twitter and Instagram now. Very few movements that I have been aware of and organizers are on Facebook for a variety of reasons. But yeah, so I'm not going to read I probably should read this out, but people to follow at It's Walela, at crutches_and_spice, at invalid_art, and at Leah Lakshmi Writes are all on people on Instagram that are great. Movement specifically, at Wear Your Voice magazine is a great one. They publish a lot of really cool articles that I've used. At Critical Resistance, that's the abolitionist organization that I interviewed. At Wet'suwet'en_checkpoint, they are an indigenous movement. They talk a lot about Line 3 right now. At Frontline Medics does a variety of work. I think they really came into public presence during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. At Working Class History is really cool. They also have a podcast that I forgot to link, but they do have a really cool podcast. At MMI Who Is Missing is about Indigenous movements for missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and femmes who have, and that whole thing, that movement. And then there's at Seeding Sovereignty, which just does covers a variety of topics, a variety of political advocacy and education work. But any of these places are great places to start and just seeing kind of what they have to offer. I highly recommend. And yeah, so you can always email me at leo.b.alanak@gmail.com if you want to chat more or have a specific question that you think of after this workshop. I'm always happy to talk about this work. I really love it and have learned a lot and would be happy to answer any questions or anything like that. And that is my last slide. So yeah.
Okay, Leo, we have about 3 minutes left, so we'll get through as many. There's 3 questions it looks like right now.
Perfect.
First one is, do you offer visual accompaniment to your podcast that would also be inclusive if you were to interview a deaf person?
Right now we do not, but that is something I have considered. What I found so far is that most people are uncomfortable being recorded video, or they're uncomfortable having their video recorded. but it is something I've considered. I know podcasts do it, and I am trying to figure out how to possibly do that moving forward. But right now we do not.
Next is, what are your thoughts on OBS as free software?
OBS. I have never heard of that. Is that an editing software? Is that an editing software?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
If you want to email me and have a conversation more about that, I can look into that and we can definitely have a conversation. I'm going to be honest, no idea what that is right off the bat.
All right, well, so the last one then, first off, one person did write in and say that they agreed with you about the prison systems. And finally is, I wanted to learn about editing for a bit. Is there any sort of beginner tools that you would recommend?
Yes, there is. Honestly, there's a variety and I'm blanking on the name of them. So again, if you reach out to me, I can definitely send you some good YouTube channels and some good written out like PDF kind of resources, because it's also dependent on if you have a preference on a specific editing system. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right resources. So definitely just reach out to me and I will help you out.
Well, perfect. We're right at the end of the hour. So thank you so much, Leo. And everybody, make sure you fill out your survey for this session. And feel free to reach out to Leo with any personal questions. I bet he'd be glad to answer them. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.